This story contains suspenseful themes and supernatural elements. It is intended for a mature audience that enjoys a good scare. Viewer discretion is advised. The wind doesn't just blow through the Blue Ridge Mountains. It breathes. It carries the scent of damp pine, old earth, and the faint metallic tang of an approaching storm. For Alara, the silence of the high ridges was supposed to be a sanctuary, a place to heal after the hectic pace of the city. But as she stood on the creaking porch of her grandfather's old timber frame cabin, the silence felt less like peace and more like a held breath. The woods here were dense, a tangled sea of oaks and hemlocks that seemed to crowd the small clearing, their branches reaching out like skeletal fingers against the darkening sky. She had inherited the cabin 3 months ago, along with a rusted key and a warning scribbled on a yellowed envelope. Stay inside when the mist rolls up from the creek. At the time, she had laughed it off as the superstition of an old man who had spent too many winters alone. Now, watching the gray fog begin to coil around the trunks of the trees like a slow-moving snake, the warning felt a lot less like a joke. The cabin sat at the very edge of Silver Creek Hollow, a place where the locals rarely ventured after sunset, claiming the valley had a way of swallowing the light. As Alara began to haul her suitcases inside, the first whisper drifted across the clearing. It wasn't a loud sound, just a soft, melodic huff of air that shaped itself into a word. Lara! Her heart skipped. No one called her that except her younger sister, Maya, who was hundreds of miles away in Atlanta. Alara dropped her bag, the thud echoing loudly in the stillness. She turned, squinting into the deepening shadows of the forest. There was nothing but the shifting leaves and the pale, ghostly bark of the birch trees. Maya, she called out, her voice trembling slightly. She knew it was impossible. Her sister wasn't here. But the sound had been so clear, so intimate, that her brain struggled to reject it. She took a step off the porch, her boots crunching on the dry leaves. The woods didn't answer. The wind died down completely, leaving an oppressive, heavy stillness that made her ears ring. She felt a sudden, sharp prickle on the back of her neck, the unmistakable sensation of being watched by something hidden just beyond the line of sight. Just as she turned to go back inside, the whisper came again, closer this time, originating from a thicket of mountain laurel just 20 feet away. Help me, Lara. I'm lost. It was Maya's voice, but there was a strange, flat quality to it, like a recording played slightly too slow. Alara's instinct was to run toward the sound, to save her sister, but a cold realization stopped her. The voice hadn't come from a person's throat. It had come from the air itself. The mountain laurel didn't rustle. Not a single leaf moved. Reason warred with emotion. Alara took another step toward the trees, her hand reaching out as if to part the darkness. She saw a flicker of movement, a pale shape retreating deeper into the hollow. Curiosity, that dangerous spark that has led so many into the dark, flared in her chest. She wanted to know. She needed to know. But as her foot touched the mossy boundary where the yard met the wild forest, the cabin's heavy oak door slammed shut behind her, seemingly moved by a sudden, violent gust of wind that didn't touch her hair. The sudden noise snapped the spell. Alara lunged back toward the porch, her heart hammering against her ribs like a trapped bird. She scrambled for the door, fumbling with the heavy iron handle. As she pulled it open and ducked inside, she glanced back one last time. In the shadows of the woods, two pale, unnaturally wide eyes flickered for a brief second before vanishing into the mist. She bolted the door and leaned against it, gasping for air. The whispers were gone, replaced by the low, rhythmic ticking of her grandfather's old grandfather clock. That night, Alara sat by the fireplace, the flames doing little to warm the chill in her bones. She realized that the mountains weren't just scenery. They were a living, breathing entity with secrets that didn't want to be kept. She had survived her first evening, but the forest had spoken her name, and she knew that once the woods have your name, they never stop calling. She looked at the old envelope again. The warning was real, but what happened to those who followed the voice? Curiosity is a gift, but without the guidance of caution, it can lead us into traps set by the things that dwell in the shadows. Always respect the boundaries between the known and the unknown. The morning sun struggled to pierce through the dense canopy of Silver Creek Hollow, casting long, distorted shadows across the cabin floor. Alara hadn't slept. Every creak of the floorboards and every rustle of the wind against the shingles had sounded like a footstep. When dawn finally broke, the mist had retreated into the lower ravines, leaving the forest looking deceptively peaceful, draped in dew and the cheerful chirping of mountain chickadees. But Alara knew better. The voice she had heard, the voice that sounded exactly like her sister, stayed with her, echoing in the quiet corners of her mind. Needing supplies and, more importantly, some human perspective, Alara decided to drive down to the small town of Pine Ridge. The town was little more than a cluster of weather-beaten buildings tucked into a valley, where the residents lived by the rhythm of the seasons and the lore of the land. She pulled up to the Hollow General Store, a place that smelled of cedar shavings, dried herbs, and old leather. Inside, the air was cool and dim, a sharp contrast to the humid mountain morning. Behind the counter sat Silas, a man whose face was a map of deep-set wrinkles, and whose eyes held the weary stillness of a mountain lake. As Alara gathered some basic groceries, she tried to keep her voice casual. "My grandfather, Thomas Miller, he used to live up at the edge of the creek. Did you know him?" Silas paused, his hand hovering over a jar of local honey. He looked up, his gaze intensifying. "Old Tom? Everyone knew him. He was a quiet man, but he knew the woods better than most. He stayed up there long after most folks would have packed up and moved to the valley. He had a duty, or so he claimed." Alara leaned against the counter, her heart racing. "He left me a note, something about the mist. And last night, I heard something, a voice. It sounded like my sister, but she's miles away." The bell above the door jangled as a gust of wind caught it, though no one entered. Silas's expression shifted from professional politeness to a grim, heavy seriousness. He set the honey down and leaned forward, his voice dropping to a low, gravelly whisper that seemed to command the very air in the room. "You're describing the mimics of the mist, girl," Silas said. "The old folks here call them the echo walkers. They aren't ghosts, not exactly. They're something older, something that belongs to the earth and the deep shadows where the sun never reaches. They don't have voices of their own, so they steal the ones that mean the most to you. They find the cracks in your heart, the grief, the longing, the love, and they use it like a fisherman uses a lure." He gripped the edge of the counter, his knuckles white. "The rule in the hollow is simple. If you hear a voice in the trees, you keep your head down and your mouth shut. You never, ever answer back." A cold shiver raced down Alara's spine. "I didn't answer," she whispered, though she remembered calling out her sister's name. "But I think it knows I heard it." Silas sighed, a sound full of ancient sorrow. "Hearing is the hook. Answering is the line. If you acknowledge them, you give them a piece of your reality. Your grandfather spent 40 years building those stone markers around that cabin and hanging those silver bells to keep the silence heavy. He knew that in Silver Creek, silence isn't just a lack of noise. It's a shield." Alara felt a wave of guilt. She had ignored the markers, thinking they were just decorative garden stones. She had let the silence break. As she checked out, Silas handed her a small bundle of dried mountain sage and a piece of advice that felt heavier than the groceries. "Go back, Alara. Secure the house. And if the whispers start again, don't just ignore them. Drown them out. Sing, talk to yourself, play the radio. Just don't let the forest think you're listening to them. The drive back up the winding mountain road felt longer than the trip down. The trees seemed to lean in closer to the pavement, their branches interlocking like a ceiling of green and brown. Alara kept her car radio tuned to a local folk station, the upbeat banjo music acting as a thin veil against the encroaching dread. She realized now that her grandfather wasn't crazy. He was a sentry, and by coming here with her modern skepticism, she had inadvertently lowered the guard on a very old, very hungry secret. When she arrived back at the cabin, the sun was already dipping behind the western peaks, casting the world in a bruised purple light. As she stepped out of the car, she froze. The silver bell her grandfather had hung from the porch eave, the one she hadn't noticed before, was gone. In its place, hanging by a thin strand of dark vine, was a small, crudely fashioned doll made of twigs and dried moss. It wore a tiny scrap of fabric that looked exactly like the shirt Alara was wearing. The forest hadn't just heard her. It was already beginning to study her. Wisdom often hides within the warnings of those who came before us. To ignore the experience of the elders is to walk blindly into the traps of the world. The twig doll swayed gently in the mountain breeze, its eyeless face seemingly staring right through Alara. It was a crude mockery of her own existence, a sign that the echo walkers were no longer just voices in the wind. They were manifesting. Her breath hitched in her throat as she reached out with trembling fingers to pull the effigy down. The moss felt cold and damp, like the skin of a frog. As soon as she tore it from the vine, a sharp, high-pitched whistle echoed from the creek bed below, followed by a sound like a dozen people clapping in unison. Then absolute silence. Alara retreated into the cabin, locking the deadbolt and shoving a heavy wooden chair under the handle. She felt exposed even behind the thick timber walls. Her grandfather's warning about the silver bells haunted her. Silas had said they kept the silence heavy. If the bell on her porch was gone, was the protection gone too? She began a frantic search of the cabin, rummaging through old trunks and dusty drawers, looking for anything that might explain her grandfather's defense against the mimics. Underneath a loose floorboard in the pantry, she found a small, velvet-lined box. Inside lay a single, intricately engraved silver bell, no larger than a walnut. Its surface was covered in swirling patterns of ivy and ancient runes that seemed to shimmer with a light of their own. Beside it was a scrap of paper in her grandfather's jagged handwriting. The silver speaks the truth when the air lies. If you find one in the wild, it is a guide. If you lose one, the shadows grow teeth. Alara gripped the bell, its cold weight oddly comforting against her palm. Driven by a desperate need to restore the cabin's perimeter, Alara waited for the sun to reach its zenith the next morning. She ventured out, her heart pounding, looking for where the porch bell might have been taken. She followed a trail of crushed ferns and snapped twigs that led toward the old stone markers her grandfather had placed. There, sitting atop a flat gray rock just inside the forest's edge, sat a bell. It wasn't the one from the porch. It was older, tarnished, and etched with symbols of a weeping eye. As she approached the rock, the air grew unnaturally cold. The whispers began again, but this time they weren't calling her name. They were humming a lullaby her mother used to sing to her when she was a child. The melody was beautiful, yet it felt jagged, like glass rubbing against silk. Alara reached for the tarnished bell, thinking it was another piece of the puzzle her grandfather had left behind. The moment her fingers brushed the metal, the lullaby stopped abruptly. The forest went so silent that she could hear the blood rushing through her own veins. She picked up the bell and shook it. It didn't ring. Instead, It emitted a low, vibrating hum that made the ground beneath her feet tremble. Suddenly, the tarnished silver began to bleed a dark, oily substance that stained her skin. Panicked, she tried to drop it, but the bell seemed stuck to her palm. From the shadows of the hemlocks, a voice whispered. Not Maya's voice this time, but her own voice, reflecting her current fear. Is it a gift, Alara? Or is it a hook? With a surge of adrenaline, she used her other hand to pry the bell loose and threw it as far as she could into the brush. She scrambled back toward the cabin, her hand burning where the dark oil had touched it. As she reached the porch, she looked back. The tarnished bell was gone. In its place stood a tall, thin figure shrouded in the mist, its limbs too long, its face a blur of shifting features. It wasn't moving, it was simply existing there, a hole in the world where a person should be. Alara burst into the cabin and slammed the door, her chest heaving. She ran to the sink and scrubbed her hand until the skin was raw, but the faint, dark stain of the oily silver remained, shaped like a tiny, distorted bell. She realized then that she had fallen for a trap. The mimics didn't just steal voices. They used curiosity and the desire for safety to lure their prey into touching things that didn't belong to this world. The silver trinket wasn't a protection, it was a mark. As night fell, a new sound began. It wasn't a whisper and it wasn't a voice. It was a rhythmic, metallic tapping against the window pane. Tink, tink, tink. Something was outside, using a piece of silver to knock on the glass, asking to be let in. Alara huddled by the dying embers of the fire, the small bell from the floorboard clutched in her hand. She realized that while her grandfather had used silver to keep the peace, the forest had learned how to use it as a weapon. Not all gifts are meant to be kept, and not every helping hand is friendly. Be cautious of things that appear too easily in times of fear, for they may be the very chains that bind you. The morning arrived with a pale, sickly light that seemed to drain the color from the world. Alara woke up in the armchair by the cold fireplace, her hand still clutching the small silver bell her grandfather had hidden. The rhythmic tink-tink-tink at the window had stopped hours ago, but the silence that replaced it was even more unnerving. It was a heavy, expectant silence, like a predator crouching in tall grass. She looked at her palm. The dark, oily stain from the night before hadn't faded. It pulsed faintly, a dull ache that throbbed in time with her heartbeat. Desperate for a sense of normalcy, Alara stepped onto the porch to breathe in the mountain air. That was when she heard it. A sound that cut through her survival instincts and struck directly at her heart. It was a sharp, joyful bark, followed by the familiar, frantic jingling of a collar. Barnaby? She breathed. Barnaby, her golden retriever, had bolted into the woods the very first night she arrived, disappearing into the mist before she could even unpack. She had spent hours calling for him, eventually fearing the worst. The bark came again, originating from the edge of the creek where the ferns grew tall and lush. It was followed by a whimpering sound, the specific, high-pitched cry Barnaby made when he was stuck or scared. Alara's mind screamed at her to remember Silas's warning. They find the cracks in your heart and use it like a lure. But the sound was so visceral, so real, that her logic began to crumble under the weight of her grief. If there was even a chance her dog was alive and hurt, she couldn't just sit on the porch. She grabbed a sturdy walking stick and her grandfather's bell, descending the porch steps. "Barnaby! Here, boy!" she called out, her voice cracking. The forest seemed to lean back, the trees parting as if to invite her in. The jingling of the collar moved further into the brush, always just out of sight, leading her away from the safety of the clearing and toward the steep, rocky terrain of the upper hollow. The further she went, the more the atmosphere changed. The air became thick and humid, smelling of stagnant water and old, rotting leaves. The path she was following, a narrow deer trail, began to behave strangely. Whenever she turned her head to look back, the trail seemed to have dissolved into a wall of thorns and thick briars. The landmarks she relied on, like the lightning-scarred oak or the mossy boulder, were no longer where they should be. It was as if the forest were a living puzzle, rearranging its pieces the moment she stepped over them. She was no longer walking through the woods. She was being swallowed by them. She reached a small clearing where the trees grew in a perfect, unsettling circle. In the center lay a red nylon collar, Barnaby's collar. Alara rushed forward and picked it up, tears blurring her vision. But as she turned the collar over in her hands, her blood turned to ice. The metal buckle wasn't metal at all. It was made of the same dark, oily wood as the twig doll. The nylon felt like dried muscle, and the name tag didn't say Barnaby. In jagged, hand-carved letters, it simply read, "Gotcha." The joyful barking stopped instantly. In its place, a chorus of voices began to rise from the circle of trees, voices of her sister, her grandfather, and even her own voice from the day before, all laughing in a discordant, mocking harmony. The trees themselves seemed to stretch upward, their branches weaving together to blot out the sky. The path she had taken to enter the clearing was gone. In every direction, there was only a wall of gray, shifting bark and the feeling of 1,000 eyes watching her from the knots in the wood. Panicked, Alara tried to run, but the ground beneath her feet felt soft and elastic, like stepping on a mattress. Every step she took away from the center of the clearing only seemed to bring her back to the gotcha collar. She was trapped in a loop, a geographical nightmare designed to wear down her resolve. The whispers grew louder, now speaking in unison, a low vibration that she felt in her teeth. "You followed the heart, Alara. Now the heart stays here." She sank to her knees, clutching her grandfather's silver bell. She realized now that the forest hadn't just used a voice. It had used her hope against her. The mimics didn't just imitate sound. They imitated the very things that made her human, turning her love into a compass that pointed toward her own destruction. As the shadows of the trees began to lengthen and crawl toward her like long, dark fingers, she knew that if she didn't find a way to silence her own heart, she would never find the way home. Do not let your heart cloud your judgment in times of danger. Emotions are our greatest strength, but when manipulated by the shadows, they can become the very chains that bind us to a mistake. The clearing was no longer just a place. It had become a cage. Alara knelt on the spongy ground, her fingers curled tightly around the silver bell her grandfather had hidden beneath the floorboards. The mocking laughter of the forest seemed to vibrate through her very bones, a symphony of stolen voices that twisted her memories into nightmares. She knew that if she stayed here, the loop would eventually tighten until she was nothing more than another echo in the hollow. Closing her eyes, she ignored the gotcha collar and the shifting walls of bark. She remembered Silas's words, "The silver speaks the truth when the air lies." With a surge of desperate hope, she rang the bell. The sound was unlike any bell she had ever heard. It wasn't a metallic chime, but a clear, piercing note that seemed to ripple through the air like a stone dropped into a still pond. Where the sound wave hit the trees, the gray, shifting bark flickered, revealing for a split second the dark, rotting void behind the illusion. The laughter stopped abruptly, replaced by a collective hiss of frustration. A path opened, not the one she had come from, but a narrow, silver-lit trail that led deeper into the fog. With no other choice, Alara ran, the bell's fading resonance acting as a flickering candle in the dark. She ran until her lungs burned and her legs felt like lead. The fog began to thin, revealing a sight that made her heart stop. There, Nestled in a small depression in the earth was her cabin. The timber walls, the stone chimney, the wide porch, it was an exact replica. For a moment, relief flooded her. She thought the bell had guided her home. But as she stepped closer, the relief turned to a cold, crawling dread. The cabin was on the wrong side of the creek. The stairs were on the left instead of the right. And the wood, when she touched the porch railing, it didn't feel like seasoned oak. It felt like cold, damp bone covered in thin, brown skin. Despite every instinct screaming at her to turn back, the door to the cabin creaked open. Inside, a warm, golden light flickered, and the smell of fresh coffee and pipe tobacco, her grandfather's scent, drifted out. "Alara? Is that you, honey? You're late for supper." A voice called from within. It was her grandfather's voice, rich and vibrant, exactly as she remembered it from her childhood. It wasn't flat like the whispers. It held the warmth of a hug. Tears pricked her eyes. Part of her wanted to believe that the forest had somehow preserved him, that this was a sanctuary. She stepped over the threshold, and the door clicked shut behind her. The interior was a perfect, mirrored image of her home. The grandfather clock stood in the corner, but its hands moved backward, ticking with a wet, fleshy sound. The photographs on the mantel showed her family, but their faces were blank, smooth expanses of skin without eyes or mouths. Alara walked toward the kitchen, where a figure sat with its back to her. "Grandpa?" she whispered. The figure turned, and Alara's scream died in her throat. It was wearing her grandfather's flannel shirt and his spectacles, but the face was a shifting mass of gray mist that struggled to hold his features. One moment it was him, the next it was Silas, then Maya, then Alara herself. "Sit down, Alara," the thing said, its voice a horrific layer of a dozen different people speaking at once. "We've been practicing. We almost have you right." It reached out a hand with too many joints and fingers that ended in sharp wooden points. The house of echoes began to moan, the walls pulsing like a giant lung. The floor beneath her feet softened, turning into a thick, dark mire that tried to pull her down. This wasn't a house at all. It was a digestive tract made of wood and mimicry, a trap designed to look like the one place she felt safe. In a moment of pure, crystalline terror, Alara realized that the grandpa figure was reaching for the silver bell in her hand. Feared the truth. She didn't run for the door. She ran for the window. As the thing rose from the table, its limbs stretching and snapping like dry kindling, Alara swung the silver bell with all her might against the glass. The moment the silver struck the pane, the entire illusion shattered. The glass turned into a web of sticky, gray silk, and the walls dissolved into a mass of tangled vines and rotting leaves. She threw herself through the gap, falling onto the cold, hard earth outside. She scrambled to her feet, looking back at the house of echoes. It was no longer a cabin. It was a massive, hollowed-out tree trunk, draped in thick, suffocating moss and filled with the bones of animals and things that were once human. The figure stood in the center of the rot, a tall, spindly shadow that hissed as the silver bell's lingering chime echoed through the clearing. Alara didn't wait. She turned and fled into the darkness, the realization sinking in that, in this forest, your own memories were the most dangerous weapons used against you. She was still lost, but she had learned the most bitter lesson of Silver Creek. The more familiar something looks, the more you should fear it. Deception often wears a familiar face to catch us when our guard is down. True safety is found in seeing the world as it is, not as we wish it to be. The night had become a blur of jagged branches and gasping breaths. Alara's boots skidded over slick moss and loose shale as she descended deeper into the gorge. The silver bell clutched so tightly in her hand that its engravings felt burned into her skin. Behind her, the house of echoes was a dying groan in the distance, but the forest around her was waking up. The trees seemed to lean toward her path, their leaves whispering in a language that sounded like 1,000 papers being shredded at once. She needed water, and she needed a boundary. In the old stories, malevolent spirits often struggled with running water. If she could reach Silver Creek, perhaps she could find a way to break the forest's hold. She burst through a final thicket of hemlocks and found herself standing on the banks of the creek. The water was black and fast-moving, white foam churning over ancient, rounded stones. The moon, a pale and uncaring eye, hung directly overhead, casting a silver sheen across the ripples. Alara collapsed by the bank, plunging her hands into the freezing water. The cold was a shock to her system, a sharp reminder of reality in a world that felt increasingly like a fever dream. But as she leaned down to splash her face, she froze. Her reflection in the water didn't move when she did. In the shimmering dark of the creek, Alara was already standing up. The reflection didn't have her exhausted eyes or her tangled hair. It looked perfect, serene, and terrifyingly calm. Alara recoiled, but the figure in the water remained, slowly stepping out of the reflection and onto the opposite bank. It was a mirror image in every detail, down to the dirt under its fingernails and the smudge of ash on its cheek. But its eyes, they weren't brown like Alara's. They were the color of the creek at midnight, deep and bottomless. "You're tired, Alara," the shadow self said. This time, the voice wasn't a mimicry. It was Alara's own voice, vibrating from a throat that looked exactly like hers. "Why keep running? The forest already knows the shape of your soul. It's easier to just let me take the weight. I don't get tired. I don't get scared." The figure took a step into the water, the current swirling around its ankles, yet the water didn't seem to touch it. It walked on the surface, a ghost made of stolen identity. Panic flared in Alara's chest, but she remembered Silas's warning. Identity is your strongest shield. She stood her ground, her heart drumming a frantic rhythm. "You aren't me," she hissed, her voice raspy from screaming. "You're just a shadow. You're just an echo of a life you'll never have." She reached for her name, repeating it like a mantra in her mind. She thought of her sister's laugh, her grandfather's smell, the feel of the sun on her skin in the city. Things this creature could never truly understand, only imitate. The mimic laughed, and the sound was like glass breaking. It lunged across the water with unnatural speed, its fingers extending into long, woody talons. Alara didn't run this time. She raised the silver bell and rang it with a violent, rhythmic force. The sound wasn't a melody. It was a command. The silver chime struck the mimic like a physical blow. The creature shrieked, its perfect face rippling and distorting, revealing the gray, featureless mist beneath. Its skin began to peel away like wet bark, falling into the creek and dissolving into foam. The mimic retreated to the far bank, its form flickering and unstable. It hissed, a sound of pure, predatory hatred, before melting back into the shadows of the trees. Alara stood panting, the bell still vibrating in her hand. She had won this encounter, but the victory felt hollow. The dark stain on her palm had grown larger, stretching toward her wrist. She realized that every time she used the bell, it took something from her. A bit of her strength, perhaps a bit of her own light. The forest wasn't just trying to kill her. It was trying to wear her down until she couldn't tell the difference between herself and the whispers. As the first hint of gray light began to bleed into the eastern sky, Alara looked down at the creek. Her reflection was back to normal, tired, frightened, but real. However, just downstream, she saw something caught in the rocks. It was a leather-bound book, soaked and battered, but unmistakable. It was her grandfather's journal. It hadn't been there a moment ago. The forest was done trying to scare her for the night. Now it was trying to lead her toward a truth she might not be ready to face. Knowing who you are is the only way to survive a world that tries to change you. Identity is not just a name. It is the sum of your memories and your will. Never let the shadows tell you who you are. The journal felt unnaturally heavy in Alara's hands, the leather cover cold and slick like the skin of a catfish. Despite being submerged in the churning waters of the creek, the pages weren't dissolving. In fact, as she climbed onto a high, flat boulder to escape the dampness of the bank, the water seemed to beat off the parchment as if the book were rejecting the moisture. She shivered, her breath blooming in the pre-dawn air. The dark stain on her palm, the mark of the silver, pulsed with a dull, rhythmic heat, seemingly reacting to the presence of her grandfather's writing. She pried the cover open. The first few pages were filled with mundane records: weather patterns, crop rotations, and the price of timber. But as she flipped further, the handwriting changed. The neat, disciplined script devolved into a jagged, frantic crawl. October 14th. One entry began. The silence is fraying. I found another silver bell cracked in half near the old mine. They are learning to hum. They are learning that if they cannot steal a voice, they can shatter the silence that protects it. I fear for the girl. I fear for Alara. She has the Miller blood, and the Hollow knows it. Alara's heart hammered against her ribs. Her grandfather hadn't been a hermit by choice. He had been a warden. The journal detailed a history that the town of Pine Ridge had long tried to forget. In the late 1800s, the Hollow had been the site of a tragic landslide that buried a small logging settlement. The survivors, trapped in the darkness and starving, began to call out to one another. Legend said their desperation was so great that the mountain itself began to echo them back, eventually consuming their identities until only the echoes remained. These were the first mimics, hollowed souls born of grief and the deep, dark earth. The Millers, her ancestors, had taken it upon themselves to be the keepers of the silence. They had discovered that silver, when forged with specific intent and marked with the runes of the valley, could anchor a person's soul to their body, preventing the mimics from unzipping their identity. But there was a cost. To protect the boundary, one Miller from every generation had to live at the edge of the creek, acting as a lightning rod for the whispers. The mark is a tether, her grandfather wrote on a page stained with what looked like dried blood. Once the silver touches the blood, the forest sees you as the gatekeeper. You cannot leave, for the whispers will follow you to the ends of the earth. You can only silence them here at the source. The realization hit Alara like a physical blow. The dark stain on her hand wasn't a curse. It was an inheritance. She wasn't just a victim of the forest. She was its intended master, or its most prized prisoner. She looked at the cabin in the distance, its silhouette stark against the rising sun. She had thought about running, about driving until the mountains were a speck in the rearview mirror, but the journal made it clear. If she left now, the echoes would hitch a ride in her mind, spreading like a virus to the world outside. As she read on, she found a sketch of the heart tree, a massive, ancient white oak located in the center of the hollow. It was here, her grandfather claimed, that the first echo was born. To seal the silence, a ritual had to be performed, a sacrifice not of blood, but of memory. One had to face the master of whispers and offer a piece of their own past to buy peace for the future. The journal ended abruptly with a final, chilling sentence. I am too old to face the heart tree again. Alara, if you are reading this, forgive me. I have left the door unlocked, but you must be the one to turn the key. A soft, mournful whistle drifted from the trees behind her. It wasn't a mimicry this time. It was the sound of the wind through the hemlocks, but it felt heavy with expectation. The forest was waiting for her choice. Alara closed the journal and tucked it into her jacket. She felt a strange, new resolve hardening within her. The fear was still there, but it was accompanied by a sense of duty. She wasn't just a girl lost in the woods anymore. She was a miller, and she had a debt to settle with the shadows. As she stood up to head back toward the cabin to prepare, she noticed something different about the woods. The trees didn't seem to be leaning in to attack her. They seemed to be bowing, as if acknowledging her presence for the first time. But in the deep shadows of the creek, she saw a row of figures, pale, thin, and featureless, standing perfectly still. They weren't attacking. They were waiting. They knew she had the book. They knew she had the mark. And they were eager to see if the new warden would break before the ritual even began. The burdens of our ancestors are often our own to carry, whether we choose them or not. True strength comes from accepting our heritage and finding the courage to finish the work that others started. The air in the hollow didn't just turn cold as the sun dipped below the jagged peaks. It turned heavy, as if the oxygen itself were being replaced by the weight of ancient memories. Alara stood in the center of the cabin, the floorboards groaning under her feet as she packed a small leather satchel. She took her grandfather's journal, the silver bell from the floorboard, and a small, framed photograph of her sister, Maya. According to the journal, the ritual at the heart tree required a tether of truth, an object of pure, untainted love to contrast the hollow mimicry of the forest. The dark stain on her hand had reached her elbow now, the skin there looking like polished charcoal, cold to the touch but burning with an inner spectral fire. The trek to the center of the hollow was a journey through a living nightmare. The trees no longer stood still. They seemed to pivot as she passed, their branches weaving together to form long, dark tunnels that distorted her sense of direction. The whispers were no longer soft. They had become a cacophony of overlapping voices, hundreds of them, sobbing, laughing, and screaming in a dozen different dialects. She kept her eyes fixed on the silver-lit path her grandfather had described. Her hand clamped over the bell in her pocket to keep it from ringing prematurely. If it rang before she reached the heart tree, the ritual would fail, and her soul would be scattered into the mist like wood smoke. Finally, she reached a vast, natural amphitheater in the deep woods. In the center stood the heart tree. It was a gargantuan white oak, its bark so pale it looked like bleached bone under the moonlight. Its roots didn't go into the ground so much as they strangled it, twisting over the earth in massive, knotty coils. This was the source, the place where the landslide had happened, and where the first echoes were born. As Alara stepped into the clearing, the wall of sound from the forest stopped instantly. The silence that followed was so absolute it felt like a physical blow to her eardrums. "I'm here," Alara whispered, her voice sounding tiny and fragile in the presence of the ancient oak. She knelt at the base of the tree, where the roots formed a natural bowl. Following the journal's instructions, she placed the photograph of Maya in the center and raised the silver bell. "I am Alara Miller, daughter of the silence. I have come to pay the debt." She swung the bell. The first chime rang out, a pure, golden note that vibrated through the white bark of the tree. Immediately, the forest exploded in sound. But these weren't just whispers anymore. From the darkness beyond the clearing, a figure emerged. It looked like Maya, not a distorted version, but Maya exactly as she had looked the last time Alara saw her, dressed in her favorite yellow raincoat, her face streaked with tears. "Alara, stop, please!" the figure screamed, its voice cracking with genuine terror. "It's hurting me. Every time you ring that bell, it's burning me. Please, big sister, stop." Alara froze, her heart shattering. The figure stumbled forward, reaching out with trembling hands. It looked so real, so vulnerable, that Alara's grip on the bell faltered. Then came another voice, her grandfather's. He appeared to her right, his form translucent and flickering. "You're killing her, Alara. This isn't the way. You've misread the journal. Throw the bell away before you destroy us all." The emotional onslaught was devastating. To see the people she loved most in the world seemingly suffering because of her actions was a torment far worse than any physical threat. The Maya figure collapsed to its knees, sobbing her name, the sound so full of agony that Alara began to weep herself. She took a step toward her sister, her hand opening to drop the silver bell. But as she looked down, she saw the dark mark on her arm. It wasn't pulsing with heat anymore. It was cold, colder than the creek. She realized that the pain her sister was feeling was a reflection of the mark's reaction to the truth. The mimics weren't being hurt. They were being revealed. She looked at Maya again, forcing herself to look past the raincoat and the tears. Behind the illusion, she saw the pale, wide eyes she had seen on her first night. The eyes that didn't blink. It was a lie. A beautiful, heart-wrenching lie designed to make her fail. With a scream of defiance that came from the very depths of her soul, Alara swung the bell a second time, and then a third. The golden notes drowned out the cries of her loved ones. The figures of Maya and her grandfather began to smoke and dissolve, their faces twisting into the featureless gray masks of the Echo Walkers. They shrieked, a sound of pure, unadulterated fury, before being sucked back into the shadows of the hemlocks. Alara collapsed against the trunk of the heart tree, her body shaking with the effort of her own bravery. She had survived the emotional trap, but the ritual wasn't over. The ground began to heave, and the massive white oak started to groan as something much larger than a mimic, began to stir beneath its roots. True bravery is not the absence of fear or the absence of pain. It is the ability to act in the face of your greatest terrors, even when your own heart is screaming at you to stop. Truth is the only light that can pierce a well-crafted lie. The ground beneath the heart tree didn't just shake, it buckled. As the third chime of the silver bell faded into the cold mountain air, the massive roots of the white oak began to shift like a nest of awakened serpents. The Master of Whispers was not a single ghost or a cryptid, but the forest itself, a collective consciousness of every lost soul and every stolen word, bound together by the ancient timber. Alara tried to stand, but the earth was no longer solid. Thick, thorny vines erupted from the soil, lashing out with predatory speed, weaving together to form a towering wall of thorns that circled the heart tree in seconds. She was no longer in a clearing. She was in a labyrinth. The sky above was quickly blotted out as the canopy of the surrounding trees knitted together, plunging the arena into a suffocating greenish gloom. The air grew thin and tasted of copper. The Master of Whispers realized that Alara's heart could not be broken by grief, so it turned to its final weapon, the confusion of the senses. The walls of the labyrinth began to move, closing in and then retreating, shifting the geometry of the clearing so that the heart tree, her only anchor to reality, seemed to be miles away one moment and directly behind her the next. "You think you see the truth, Miller?" The forest roared. This wasn't a whisper. It was a thunderous vibration that shook the leaves from the trees. "Your eyes are but windows into a house we have already invaded." Suddenly, Alara's vision began to fail. The silver light of the moon turned into a blinding, nauseating strobe of colors. The world tilted. She saw the ground where the sky should be. She saw her own hands stretching out into impossibly long wooden branches. The forest was attacking her perception, trying to convince her mind that she was already becoming one of them. Panic, cold and sharp, threatened to swallow her. She stumbled, her hands scraping against the thorns of the shifting walls. She tried to rely on the silver bell, but when she rang it, the sound was muffled, as if the air had turned into thick wool. The master was dampening the silver's resonance. Alara realized that as long as she tried to see her way out, she would remain lost. Her eyes were being fed lies by the mist. To survive, she had to stop looking and start knowing. She closed her eyes tight, shutting out the swirling, psychedelic nightmare. She sank to her knees and pressed her marked palm against the cold, damp earth. She stopped listening to the roar of the forest and started feeling for the heartbeat of the land. Beneath the malice and the echoes, there was a steady ancient pulse, the true spirit of the Blue Ridge Mountains, a spirit that was indifferent to the mimics. She felt the vibration of the heart tree's deepest roots, a low-frequency hum that cut through the cacophony. Guided by touch and the heat of the mark on her arm, Alara began to crawl. She ignored the voices that told her she was walking off a cliff. She ignored the sensation of phantom insects crawling over her skin. She focused entirely on the pull of the silver-marked blood in her veins toward the silver-forged spirit of the tree. The thorns lashed at her, tearing her jacket and stinging her skin, but she didn't flinch. She was a needle being pulled toward a magnet. The labyrinth of vines was a test of faith, faith in herself over the evidence of her own distorted senses. With a final, desperate lunge, her hand slammed against something hard, cool, and unmistakably solid. The bark of the heart tree. The moment she touched it with her marked hand, the labyrinth let out a final, screeching howl of wind. The illusory walls shattered like dry glass, and the canopy above tore open, revealing the cold, indifferent stars once more. Alara was back at the base of the oak, her clothes tattered and her breath coming in ragged gasps. The Master of Whispers had failed to lead her astray, but its physical form was now manifesting. A towering mass of shadow and rotting wood rising from the center of the tree itself. When the world around you becomes a chaos of lies and confusion, do not trust what you see or hear. Trust your intuition and the core of your being. Your inner compass is the only thing that cannot be fooled by the shadows. The air around the heart tree didn't just vibrate, it curdled. Out of the very center of the ancient white oak, a figure began to tear itself free. It was not a man, nor was it a beast. It was a towering, spindly nightmare of gray, petrified wood and tangled black vines, standing nearly 10 feet tall. Its face was a smooth, featureless mask of pale bark, save for a jagged vertical crack where a mouth should be. This was the Master of Whispers, the core of the hollow's hunger. As it moved, it emitted a sound that made Alara's teeth ache, a discordant hum of 1,000 voices all trying to speak the same word at once. Alara stood her ground, though her legs felt like water. The dark mark on her arm was now a deep, obsidian black, glowing with a cold, pale light that matched the silver bell in her hand. The Master of Whispers raised a limb that looked like a lightning-struck branch and pointed it at her. Suddenly, the air was filled with the most painful sound of all. The voice of her grandfather, not as she remembered him, but as he was in his final moments, weak, terrified, and calling her name with a plea for help. Alara! It's so dark. Save me from the tree. No, Alara whispered, her voice gaining a strength she didn't know she possessed. You are not him. You are nothing but the breath in a hollow reed. She realized that the Master thrived on the echo, the lingering pain of the past. To defeat it, she had to offer it something it couldn't replicate. A moment of absolute, present-tense truth. She reached into her satchel and pulled out the small silver bell her grandfather had hidden under the floorboards. She didn't ring it this time. Instead, she pressed it into the center of the heart of the tree, the small bowl formed by the roots where she had placed Maya's photo. She closed her eyes and poured every ounce of her will into the silver. She thought of the future, of the life she would lead, the sounds of the city, the warmth of a real hug, and the simple, quiet dignity of a life lived in the light. She wasn't fighting with hate. She was fighting with the weight of her own existence. "I am Alara Miller," she shouted over the roar of the forest. "And I am the end of the echo." She slammed her marked palm onto the silver bell, pinning it against the white bark of the heart tree. The reaction was instantaneous. A blinding flash of pure, silver light erupted from the point of contact, surging through the roots and up the trunk like a bolt of reverse lightning. The Master of Whispers let out a final, ear-piercing shriek, a sound that wasn't a mimicry, but the true, hollow cry of the void. The gray wood of its body began to crack and splinter, turning into fine, white ash that was caught by a sudden, violent upward draft. The heavy, oppressive atmosphere of the hollow shattered, replaced by a sudden, cooling breeze that smelled of rain and fresh earth. As the light faded, the forest fell into a new kind of silence. It wasn't the heavy, predatory silence of a trap, but the peaceful, resting silence of a graveyard after the ghosts have been laid to rest. Alara slumped against the tree, exhausted. The dark mark on her arm didn't vanish, but it faded to a faint, silvery scar, a permanent reminder of her role as the new warden. The master was gone, but the forest remained, and it would always need someone to make sure the silence stayed heavy. The first rays of a true dawn began to spill over the mountains, painting the world in gold and rose. Alara walked back toward her cabin, her footsteps sure and steady. The trees didn't bow, and they didn't whisper. They simply stood, as trees should. When she reached the porch, she found Silas standing there, holding a thermos of coffee. He looked at her arm, then at her eyes, and gave a slow, respectful nod. "The mountain is quiet today," he said simply. "First time in 40 years I haven't heard the creek humming." Alara took the coffee. The warmth seeped into her bones. She looked out over the valley, realizing that while she had lost her old life, she had gained a purpose. She would stay. She would keep the silver bells polished and the stone markers upright. She would be the guardian of the silence, ensuring that no more wanderers would follow the whispers to their doom. She was no longer afraid of the dark, for she had become the one who kept the shadows in their place. Her last mistake hadn't been following the whispers. It had been doubting her own strength to silence them. Moral of the story: the greatest mistakes often lead to our greatest callings. When we face our fears and accept our responsibilities, we transform from victims of the darkness into guardians of the light. Honor your past, but never let it speak for your future.